The morning air over the small town of Millbrook Falls smelled like fried dough and gasoline, the kind of smell that only comes once a year when the whole town gathers for its biggest celebration. Flags lined the main street, children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and somewhere in the distance, a low rumble began to grow louder, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles approaching the old bridge at the edge of town. Standing in the middle of that narrow road, dressed in clothes that had not been washed in days, stood a 20-year-old black woman with desperation written across her face. She raised both arms toward the approaching riders and screamed with everything she had left in her lungs. "Stop! It's a trap!" Nobody moved to help her. Nobody believed a single word. They knew her only as the homeless girl who slept beneath the bridge, the one mothers warned their children to stay away from, the one shopkeepers chased off their sidewalks without a second thought. To the people of Millbrook Falls, she was background noise, a problem nobody wanted to solve. But the leader of the motorcycle group riding toward that bridge looked into her eyes and saw something the rest of the crowd refused to see, a fear too real to be madness. In the space of 3 seconds, he made a decision that would save the lives of 15 riders behind him. And what the town discovered underneath that old bridge later that day would leave grown men in tears and change Millbrook Falls forever. Her name was Maya Johnson, and 5 years earlier she had been an ordinary teenager with a mother who loved her fiercely. Before everything fell apart, Maya had been the kind of girl who laughed loudly in school hallways and dreamed of becoming a nurse, just like her mother. Her mother, Diane Johnson, worked the night shift at the regional hospital, the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's birthday and snuck extra blankets to children who were scared of the dark. The two of them lived in a small, rented house on the edge of town, poor by most standards but rich in the only currency that mattered between a mother and a daughter. Then, on a rainy October night, when Maya was just 15 years old, a drunk driver crossed the center line on Route 9 and ended Diane Johnson's life instantly. Maya was left with nothing but a funeral she could barely afford to attend, and a silence in that little house that never went away. The county placed Maya into the foster care system within weeks, promising her that someone would take care of her the way her mother once had. That promise was broken almost immediately. Over the following 3 years, she was shuffled between 6 different foster homes, each one colder than the last, each one treating her less like a grieving child and more like a check that arrived in the mail every month. In one home, she was locked out of the kitchen after dinner hours. In another, she slept in a converted garage with no heat through 2 winters. In one of those homes, a woman named Carol Pittman had taken in 4 foster children purely for the monthly checks the state provided, feeding them little more than boxed noodles, while spending the rest of the money on herself without a hint of shame. Maya remembered lying awake at night in that house, listening to the other children cry quietly into their pillows, learning early that comfort was something she would have to manufacture for herself, since nobody else seemed willing to offer it. In another placement, a well-meaning but overwhelmed couple returned her to the agency after only 4 months, explaining gently that they simply did not have the resources to manage a teenager carrying so much grief. Each transfer chipped away a little more of the girl Maya used to be, until by the time she turned 18, she had learned to expect disappointment before it even arrived. The system released her that year with a single duffel bag, $20 folded into her pocket, and a piece of paper telling her she was now, officially, an adult responsible for herself. With nowhere else to go, Maya found her way back to Millbrook Falls, the only place that had ever felt remotely like home, even if home no longer existed there. She found an old, abandoned stretch of land beneath the town's historic stone bridge, a place forgotten by everyone except the birds and the river beneath it. She built a small shelter out of cardboard, tarp, and a few wooden pallets she found behind the hardware store. Every morning, she walked the 2 miles into town to collect aluminum cans and plastic bottles from the trash bins behind restaurants, trading them for whatever coins the recycling center would give her. It was barely enough to survive, but survival had become the only goal Maya allowed herself to have. She kept her mother's old nursing badge, wrapped carefully, in a plastic bag inside her duffel, the one possession she refused to trade or lose, no matter how desperate the week became. Every night before sleep, she traced the worn edges of that badge with her thumb, whispering quiet promises to a woman who could no longer hear them promises about finishing school one day and becoming the kind of nurse Diane Johnson would have been proud to call her daughter. The river beneath the bridge became, in its own strange way, the only constant companion Maya had left, its steady current. A reminder that some things in the world kept moving forward, no matter how still her own life had become. The people of Millbrook Falls did not see a grieving daughter or a failed systems casualty. They saw a problem. The owner of the corner coffee shop, a man named Russell Pratt, chased her away from his storefront more times than either of them could count, shouting that she was scaring off paying customers just by standing near his window. School children walking home pointed and laughed when they saw her digging through trash cans, some of them throwing half-eaten food at her feet like she was an animal to be baited. Grown adults crossed entire streets just to avoid walking past her, clutching their purses a little tighter, refusing even to meet her eyes. Maya learned quickly that in the eyes of her town, she had become invisible in the worst possible way, seen only long enough to be judged, never long enough to be helped. Once, during a particularly brutal cold spell, she had worked up the courage to ask a church volunteer handing out coats if there might be a spare one her size, only to be told, not unkindly, but firmly, that the coats were reserved for families with children rather than young women who chose to live the way she did. The word chose had stung more than the cold itself, as though anyone could look at her circumstances and believe for even a moment that this was a life she had selected from a list of better options. Despite everything, Maya remained quietly observant, watching the world from beneath that old bridge with sharper eyes than anyone gave her credit for. Over the weeks leading up to the town's annual charity festival, she began noticing something strange happening after dark near her makeshift home. Strangers she had never seen before would appear in the dead of night, carrying large crates and metal equipment down toward the bridge's support structure. At first she told herself it was nothing, perhaps construction workers doing late repairs, but something about the way they moved, quiet, careful, glancing over their shoulders, told her this was not ordinary work. She tried mentioning it once to a passing police cruiser, only to be waved off without the officer even rolling down his window. 1 week before the festival, Maya woke in the cold hours past midnight to the low growl of a truck engine idling somewhere above her head. She lay perfectly still beneath her thin blanket, listening to the unmistakable clang of metal striking metal, followed by hushed voices carried on the night wind. Curiosity, and perhaps a survival instinct, sharpened by years of watching her back, pulled her out from under her shelter and toward the shadows near the bridge's stone foundation. What she saw made her blood run cold. 4 men, faces partially hidden beneath dark hoods and masks, were lowering heavy steel equipment down toward the bridge's main support beams, working with the focused efficiency of men who had done this kind of thing before. Maya pressed herself flat against the cold stone, barely breathing, as she listened to fragments of their conversation drifting through the night air. The flashlight beams swept dangerously close to where she hid more than once, forcing her to flatten herself even further into a crevice between 2 boulders, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears, she feared the men might somehow hear it over the rushing water below. One man, his voice low and gravelly, muttered something about everything coming down at exactly the right moment. Another responded with a short, cold laugh, saying that the bikers would never see it coming. A third voice, calmer and more measured than the others, reminded his companions to make sure the cuts looked like natural rust and wear rather than anything deliberate, in case anyone ever thought to inspect the beams closely afterward. Maya did not understand the full scope of what she was witnessing, but she understood enough to know that something terrible was being planned, something timed to happen soon, something that would hurt people who had no idea danger was waiting for them. Her hands trembled as she crept back to her shelter, replaying their words over and over in her mind until the sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn. The next morning, Maya did something she had not done in years. She walked directly into the police station and asked to speak with someone in charge. The officer at the front desk barely looked up from his paperwork, telling her that without a phone number, an address, or any form of identification, there was little anyone could do with vague claims about men under a bridge at night. She tried explaining what she had heard, the mention of timing, the laughter about the bikers, but the officer's expression made it clear he had already decided her story carried no weight. Frustrated and frightened, Maya left the station with the same heavy dread sitting in her chest, knowing that whatever was coming would not wait for someone to finally take her seriously. What made the timing so dangerous was the simple fact that Millbrook Falls had only one major event left on its calendar that season: the town's biggest charity festival, scheduled to take place in exactly 7 days. Every year, the festival drew crowds from 3 surrounding counties, filling the streets with food vendors, live music, and a parade route that always crossed directly over the historic stone bridge. And every year, the parade's most anticipated highlight was the arrival of a beloved group of motorcyclists who led the procession with thundering engines and roaring cheers from the crowd. This year would be no exception, and the route, as always, would take all 15 riders directly across that same aging bridge Maya had watched strangers tampering with in the dark. The riders everyone in Millbrook Falls so eagerly anticipated were known throughout the region as the Iron Riders, a name that had earned deep respect rather than fear over the better part of 2 decades. Despite their leather jackets, tattoos, and roaring engines, not a single member of the group carried a criminal record worth mentioning. Among their 15 members were former soldiers who had served overseas, retired firefighters who had spent careers pulling strangers from burning buildings, mechanics who fixed cars for single mothers free of charge, and long-haul truck drivers who knew every back road in the state. Each year, the Iron Riders organized a massive charity ride that raised tens of thousands of dollars for children battling serious illnesses and for families of soldiers still stationed far from home. Just 2 years earlier, the group had personally covered the cost of a heart surgery for a 6-year-old boy from a neighboring county whose family had exhausted every other avenue of help available to them. Another member, a retired firefighter named Walter Briggs, had quietly paid off the mortgage of a fallen soldier's widow using funds raised entirely through the group's annual ride, never once asking for recognition or thanks. Stories like these had earned the Iron Riders something far more valuable than fear or notoriety. They had earned the genuine love of an entire region that had come to see them, not as outlaws on motorcycles, but as guardians who simply happened to travel on 2 wheels. Leading this group of 15 was a man named Jack Turner, 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with a calm but commanding presence that made people listen the moment he spoke. Jack had spent 20 years as a Marine before returning home to Millbrook Falls, where he opened a small motorcycle repair shop that eventually became the unofficial headquarters of the Iron Riders. His own childhood had not been an easy one either, raised by a single father who worked double shifts at the local mill, and Jack often said that the values the Marines instilled in him, loyalty, discipline, and an unwillingness to leave anyone behind, were the same values he tried to bring to every charity ride the group organized. He was known throughout town as a man who believed deeply in fairness, who never raised his voice unless absolutely necessary, and who had personally helped more struggling families than most people in Millbrook Falls would ever know about. More than one local family had quietly received an envelope of cash on their doorstep during a hard winter, never knowing it had come from Jack, and the small fund the Iron Riders kept set aside, specifically for moments like that. This year, the festival committee had given Jack and his riders the honor of leading the entire parade, a route that would take them straight across the historic stone bridge at exactly the moment hundreds of spectators lined both sides of the road to watch them pass. With the danger growing clearer in her mind and the festival date drawing closer, Maya grew increasingly desperate to find someone, anyone, willing to listen to her warning. She walked straight into the mayor's office, waiting nearly 2 hours in a hallway before a secretary finally told her the mayor had no time for unscheduled visitors, especially ones without an appointment or a clear, credible complaint. She tried the festival organizing committee next, standing outside their planning meeting, until a volunteer politely but firmly asked her to leave the premises before she frightened away potential sponsors. Every door Maya knocked on closed a little faster than the last. Every face that looked at her carried the same expression of dismissal she had grown sickeningly familiar with over the past 3 years. Word eventually spread through certain corners of town that the homeless girl under the bridge was telling wild stories about saboteurs and explosives, and the reaction was exactly what Maya had feared it would be. Some residents laughed it off entirely, telling each other that the poor girl probably imagined the whole thing out of boredom or desperation for attention. Others grew openly hostile, with one woman at the grocery store loudly announcing that someone needed to make sure that girl did not ruin the town's biggest celebration of the year with her nonsense. The festival committee chairwoman, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had spent 11 years building the event's reputation as the highlight of the regional calendar, took Maya's warnings as a personal insult, telling a volunteer within earshot that the last thing this town needed was some drifter scaring off sponsors with baseless accusations. A police officer eventually approached Maya near the town square, telling her firmly that if she continued spreading rumors that could cause public panic, she would be removed from the area entirely before festival day arrived. Maya stood her ground as long as she could, but when the officer's hand moved toward her shoulder, she finally backed away, tears stinging her eyes as the weight of being utterly powerless settled over her once again. That night, sitting alone beneath the bridge with the cold stone at her back, Maya allowed herself to cry in a way she had not cried since the day she buried her mother. She thought about giving up entirely, about simply walking away from Millbrook Falls and letting whatever was going to happen, happen, since nobody in this town had ever shown her an ounce of the same compassion her own mother had given so freely to strangers. But somewhere in that darkness, a different feeling rose up inside her, something fierce and stubborn that refused to let 15 innocent people pay the price for a town's unwillingness to listen. If nobody would believe her warning, then she decided she would simply stand in front of those motorcycles herself and force them to stop, even if it meant putting her own body between danger and people who had never once shown her kindness. As the morning of the festival arrived, and she watched the crowds gather from a distance, a strange calm settled over her. Despite the fear still coursing through her veins, she thought of her mother, of the countless nights Diane Johnson had walked into hospital rooms nobody else wanted to enter, simply because someone inside needed help and she happened to be the only one willing to give it. Whatever happened next, Maya decided, she would not let fear keep her silent the way the rest of the town's silence had nearly let tragedy happen. Festival day arrived bright and warm, with Millbrook Falls transformed into a sea of color and sound unlike any other day of the year. Banners stretched between lampposts, food trucks lined the square, releasing the smell of grilled meat and funnel cake into the air, and a local band tuned their instruments on a small wooden stage near the town's center. Hundreds of residents poured into the streets, children waving small flags, elderly couples seated in folding chairs along the parade route, teenagers crowding near the bridge, for the best view of the year's most anticipated moment. Excitement buzzed through the crowd as word spread that the Iron Riders had begun their approach from the highway, their engines already audible in the distance, like a rolling wave of thunder drawing closer with every passing second. Vendors selling lemonade and roasted corn called out over the noise, while a group of teenagers near the bridge railing held up handmade signs welcoming the riders by name, several of them having grown up attending the charity ride every single year of their lives. Somewhere near the stage, the mayor stood ready with a microphone, prepared to deliver his usual opening remarks the moment the motorcycles rolled into view, completely unaware of how drastically the next few minutes were about to unfold. As the first motorcycles came into view at the far end of the bridge approach, the crowd erupted into cheers, waving and clapping as 15 gleaming machines rolled forward in perfect formation. Jack Turner rode at the very front, his expression calm and proud beneath his helmet, leading his fellow riders toward the bridge that had carried festival parades safely for generations. Behind the barricades, parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view, and somewhere near the edge of the crowd, an elderly woman wiped a proud tear from her eye, remembering how much good these riders had done for families like hers over the years. Nobody among that cheering crowd had any idea that beneath the very pavement those motorcycles were about to cross, a hidden danger waited, patient and silent, for the exact weight and vibration it had been engineered to meet. That was the moment Maya Johnson ran directly into the street, placing herself squarely between the cheering crowd and the approaching wall of motorcycles. Her voice tore through the festive noise with a desperation that silenced everyone within earshot. "Stop! It's a trap!" she screamed, arms raised, body trembling, tears streaming down a face that had not known a single moment of peace in years. For a brief, suspended second, the entire crowd seemed to freeze, caught between confusion and disbelief at the sight of the homeless girl standing fearlessly in front of 15 oncoming motorcycles. Then the mockery began almost instantly, voices shouting for her to get out of the road, parents covering their children's ears against the curses now flying from frustrated onlookers, security guards already pushing through the crowd to physically remove her from the parade route. Someone near the front threw a half-empty water bottle that landed near her feet, while another voice yelled that she was finally getting the attention she had always wanted. The cruelty of the moment lost entirely on a crowd that still had no idea what stood beneath their feet. Maya did not flinch, did not turn to run despite every instinct screaming at her to do exactly that, planting her bare feet firmly against the warm pavement as the motorcycles drew closer with each passing second. But Jack Turner, seated at the very front of that formation, did something none of the jeering crowd expected him to do. He looked past the chaos and the insults being hurled at the girl in the street, and he focused entirely on her face, on the kind of terror that no attention-seeking stunt could ever fully replicate. He had seen real fear plenty of times in his life. On battlefields, in burning buildings his firefighter friends described, in the eyes of frightened soldiers he had once commanded. And what he saw in Maya's eyes in that instant matched every one of those memories perfectly. Without a second thought, Jack raised his fist high into the air, the universal signal among riders to stop immediately, and within seconds, all 15 motorcycles ground to a halt, just feet away from where Maya stood, her chest heaving, her legs barely able to hold her weight any longer. The crowd fell into a stunned, uncertain silence as Jack dismounted his motorcycle and walked toward the trembling young woman standing alone in the middle of the road. He removed his helmet, knelt slightly to meet her eyes, and asked her calmly, but firmly, to explain exactly what she meant by her warning. Maya, shaking and barely able to catch her breath, told him everything in a rush of words: the strangers in the night, the heavy equipment lowered beneath the bridge, the conversation about timing, and about the bikers never seeing it coming. Jack listened without interrupting once, his expression growing more serious with every sentence she spoke, his instincts as a former Marine telling him that this was not the rambling of a confused mind, but the desperate account of someone who had genuinely witnessed something dangerous. Rather than dismiss her the way everyone else in town had, Jack turned to 3 of his most trusted riders, men he had known for over a decade, and asked them to accompany him beneath the bridge to check the support structure immediately. The crowd watched in tense silence as the 4 men climbed down the embankment toward the river, disappearing beneath the stone arches where Maya had spent so many cold nights alone. Minutes passed that felt like hours to everyone gathered above, the festival music now silent, the only sound, the rushing water beneath the bridge, and the murmured uncertainty spreading through the crowd. When Jack finally climbed back up the embankment, his face had gone pale, and the look in his eyes told the entire town that whatever he had found down there was far worse than anyone had imagined. Jack explained, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd, that one of the bridge's main steel support beams had been deliberately cut nearly all the way through, hidden cleverly enough that a casual inspection would never have noticed the damage. Several other critical support points showed clear signs of deliberate tampering as well, weakened just enough to hold under normal foot traffic, but almost certainly destined to collapse under the combined weight and vibration of 15 motorcycles crossing at once. Engineers called immediately to the scene confirmed within the hour that had those motorcycles crossed the bridge as planned, the structure would very likely have given way entirely, sending riders and possibly nearby pedestrians crashing into the river below. The realization rippled through the crowd like a physical wave, parents pulling their children closer, elderly residents covering their mouths in shock, the cheerful festival atmosphere replaced entirely by a heavy, grim silence. Patricia Hale, the festival chairwoman who had dismissed Maya's warnings as the ramblings of an attention-seeking drifter only days earlier, stood frozen near the stage, her face drained of all color, as the weight of what almost happened settled over her. Several riders climbed off their motorcycles and walked slowly toward Maya, removing their helmets in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, as though acknowledging without words that this young woman had just done something none of them would ever be able to repay. The same crowd that had hurled insults and water bottles only minutes earlier now stood in stunned, shamed silence, many of them unable to meet Maya's eyes, for entirely different reasons than before. Police arrived in force within minutes, cordoning off the bridge entirely and beginning an immediate investigation into what had clearly been a deliberate act of sabotage. Officers who had laughed off Maya's warnings just days earlier now stood before her, notebooks in hand, asking her to repeat every detail she could remember about the men she had seen under the bridge. For the first time since her mother's death, Maya found herself being listened to with genuine seriousness, her words treated not as the ramblings of a troubled mind, but as critical evidence in what was rapidly becoming the most significant criminal investigation Millbrook Falls had seen in decades. The same police chief who had once threatened to remove her from the town square now personally thanked her, his voice heavy with the unmistakable weight of guilt over how close his department had come to allowing a catastrophe. Over the following days, investigators pulled traffic camera footage from intersections near the bridge, slowly piecing together the identities of the men responsible for the sabotage. What emerged was not the work of random vandals or thrill-seeking criminals, but a calculated scheme involving a small group of local developers and contractors with deep financial motives. These men had known for months that the town's aging bridge was structurally weak and scheduled for an expensive renovation contract that several competing companies were bidding to win. Rather than wait for the natural decision-making process, they had decided to manufacture a disaster severe enough to force emergency construction, intending to position their own company as the only contractor capable of responding immediately, securing a contract worth millions of dollars through manufactured tragedy. Investigators identified the ringleader as a contractor named Gerald Voss, a man who had lost the original renovation bid 2 months earlier, and had been overheard at a local bar complaining bitterly about losing what he called the contract of a lifetime. Voss had recruited 3 men who owed him money from previous jobs, promising each a share of the profits once his company secured the emergency rebuilding contract that would inevitably follow a disaster of the scale they were planning. Phone records later obtained by investigators showed the 4 men had been meeting secretly for nearly 2 months, carefully scouting the bridge and timing their visits around the limited security patrols that covered that stretch of road after dark. Gerald Voss and his 3 accomplices were arrested within 48 hours of the festival, taken into custody at a job site 2 counties away where they had been preparing equipment for an unrelated project, seemingly confident that no one had connected them to the sabotage. At his arraignment, Voss reportedly showed no remorse, telling reporters gathered outside the courthouse that he had simply been trying to secure work that rightfully should have gone to his company in the first place, a statement that drew audible gasps from family members of the riders who had nearly been killed. Prosecutors later announced that all 4 men faced multiple charges, including conspiracy, criminal sabotage, and attempted manslaughter, charges serious enough that legal experts predicted decades behind bars for each of them if convicted. For Maya, watching the news coverage of the arrests from the small television in her temporary motel room, there was no satisfaction in the moment, only a quiet, exhausted relief that the danger she had carried alone for over a week had finally been taken out of her hands. The full scope of their plan was almost unbearable to consider. Men willing to sacrifice 15 innocent riders and potentially dozens of festival spectators purely for financial gain. Investigators discovered detailed notes in one suspect's truck describing exactly how the timed collapse would create enough public outrage to fast-track emergency funding, conveniently bypassing the normal bidding process that had favored their competitors. They had even discussed, almost casually in recorded conversations later obtained through warrants, how public sympathy following such a tragedy would make it politically impossible for officials to choose any contractor other than the one who appeared ready to act swiftly in the town's moment of crisis. Maya Johnson, the girl nobody in town had wanted to look in the eye, had single-handedly uncovered and prevented what could have become one of the deadliest planned disasters in the region's history. As the investigation unfolded, reporters and curious residents alike began asking a question that had somehow never occurred to anyone in Millbrook Falls before. Who exactly was this young woman, and how had she ended up living alone beneath a bridge in the first place? Slowly, painfully, the full story of Maya Johnson's life began to surface, starting with the truth about her mother, Diane Johnson, the beloved nurse who had spent 15 years caring for the town's sick and dying, with a gentleness many still remembered vividly. Elderly patients she had once cared for came forward with stories of midnight visits, of Diane sneaking in extra medication for those who could not afford it, of a woman who had quite literally given everything she had to a community that, it turned out, had given almost nothing back to her daughter when she needed it most. The deeper details of Maya's life after her mother's death revealed a pattern of abandonment that left even hardened community members visibly shaken. Stories surfaced of Maya sleeping outside through brutal winter nights, with nothing but a thin blanket for warmth, of going days without a proper meal, while passing dozens of restaurants whose owners had refused her even table scraps. Former classmates recalled how she had once applied for nearly every entry-level job in town, only to be turned away repeatedly, the moment potential employers learned about her living situation, as though poverty itself were a character flaw rather than a circumstance she had been forced into by a broken system. One particularly painful account came from a diner owner who admitted, with visible shame during a later interview, that he had once watched Maya stand outside his restaurant in the rain for nearly 20 minutes, clearly hoping someone might offer her a seat, before quietly walking away when no one did. A former teacher remembered Maya as one of the brightest students she had ever taught, a girl who had once dreamed of scholarships and nursing school, and wept openly when she realized how completely that bright future had been allowed to slip away unnoticed. Jack Turner, listening to these accounts gathered by a local reporter, found himself overwhelmed by an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show in public, a deep, aching grief over how thoroughly an entire town had failed one of its own children. The realization spread through Millbrook Falls like a slow-burning fire, shame mixing with grief, as residents began to understand the full weight of what their indifference had nearly cost them. A town hall meeting was called within the week, not by the mayor's office initially, but by ordinary citizens who felt an urgent need to address what had happened and what it revealed about their community. The meeting hall filled beyond capacity that evening, every seat taken, residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway, all of them drawn by a shared, unspoken need to confront the truth about how they had treated Maya Johnson. The mayor stood before that packed room and offered an apology that carried none of the usual political polish, his voice cracking, as he admitted that his office had dismissed a desperate warning simply because it came from someone society had taught them to overlook. The police chief followed, acknowledging publicly that his officers had threatened to forcibly remove the very person who ultimately saved 15 lives, a fact that would haunt the department for years to come. One be one, residents who had once mocked or ignored Maya rose from their seats to speak, their voices thick with shame, as they admitted to judgments made purely on the basis of her appearance and circumstances, rather than her character or her words. An elderly woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who had lived in Millbrook Falls her entire life, stood slowly and addressed the room with words that would be repeated throughout the town for years afterward. "We did not see her," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but clear, "because we chose not to look." The simple honesty of that statement landed like a physical blow across the room, and within seconds, quiet sobbing could be heard from multiple corners of the meeting hall, neighbors reaching for each other's hands, strangers embracing strangers in shared grief over a collective failure too painful to fully articulate. Russell Pratt, the coffee shop owner, who had chased Maya from his storefront more times than he could count, stood next, his voice barely above a whisper, as he admitted that he had judged her appearance without ever once asking her name. He offered, right there in front of the entire room, to give her a standing job at his shop for as long as she wanted one, a gesture that drew quiet applause even through the tears still falling across the hall. Even hardened residents who rarely showed emotion in public found themselves wiping away tears they could not explain or control. Jack Turner rose from his seat near the front of the hall, walked deliberately toward where Maya sat quietly near the back, and knelt before her with a small leather patch in his weathered hands. It was the official honorary patch of the Iron Riders, a symbol given only to those the group considered family, regardless of whether they had ever sat on a motorcycle in their life. He told her, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly fighting to break through, that courage was not something that could be taught or bought, only chosen, and that she had chosen it when 15 lives depended entirely on her willingness to stand in front of danger that everyone else refused to acknowledge. As he placed that patch gently into her hands, the entire room rose to their feet in thunderous applause, a sound Maya had never once heard directed at herself in her entire life. In the weeks that followed that emotional town hall, the transformation in Millbrook Falls happened with a speed that surprised even those who had organized it. A local business owner, who had once chased Maya away from her storefront, offered her a steady job instead, training her personally in customer service and bookkeeping, with a patience she had never previously shown. The town's community center, recently renovated thanks to donations pouring in from residents eager to make amends, set aside a furnished apartment specifically for Maya, free of charge for the first year while she found her footing. County officials, perhaps motivated as much by public scrutiny as genuine remorse, quietly reviewed and reformed several foster care policies that had failed Maya and likely countless other children moving through that same broken system. 6 months passed, and the young woman who had once slept beneath a bridge, surrounded by cardboard and tarp, now lived in a small but warmly furnished apartment 3 blocks from the town's center. She worked steady hours at the community center, helping coordinate programs for at-risk youth, drawing on her own painful experiences to ensure other children would not fall through the same cracks that had nearly swallowed her whole. She kept her mother's nursing badge on a small shelf above her bed now, no longer needing to hide it inside a plastic bag for protection, displayed instead as a quiet promise she intended to keep. In the evenings, she attended classes at the local community college, slowly working toward the nursing degree her mother had once dreamed she would earn, carrying Diane Johnson's memory forward in the most meaningful way she knew how. Jack Turner had taken to checking in on her every Sunday afternoon, sometimes bringing along 2 or 3 other riders, turning what began as a single act of courage into a steady, ongoing friendship neither of them had expected. The Iron Riders, true to the patch they had given her, had become something Maya had not had in 5 long years, a family that showed up consistently, without conditions, without judgment. On the morning of the town's next charity ride, exactly 1 year after the day she had stood screaming in front of 15 motorcycles, Maya found herself climbing onto the back of Jack Turner's bike for the very first time. The newly rebuilt bridge stretched ahead of them, stronger and safer than the old structure had ever been, its steel beams gleaming in the early morning sunlight, as residents lined the streets once again to watch the parade begin. As the engines roared to life around her, Jack turned slightly and spoke words that settled deep into Maya's heart. "That day," he said, "you saved our lives." Maya smiled, the first truly peaceful smile she had allowed herself in years, and answered him simply. "No," she said. "That day, this town finally saved mine." The procession rolled forward across the rebuilt bridge, 15 motorcycles and 1 young woman who had once been invisible, now riding proudly through streets that had learned, however painfully, to truly see her. At the center of that bridge stood a newly mounted plaque, bronze letters catching the morning light for every traveler to read as they passed. It read simply, "Maya Johnson Bridge, in honor of the girl who chose courage when no one chose her." Visitors from neighboring towns would sometimes stop their cars just to read those words, asking locals to tell them the story, and the people of Millbrook Falls had learned to tell it not with pride in their own goodness, but with honesty about how close they had come to losing everything through simple, careless indifference. Beneath that plaque, the river continued flowing exactly as it always had, indifferent to human struggle, while above it, an entire town carried forward a lesson it would never again allow itself to forget. Sometimes, the very person the world chooses to ignore is the one quietly standing guard over everyone else's tomorrow.